Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the most shocking twists and turns of your favorite daytime drama. Today is a thrilling day to unpack the latest explosive developments that will leave you absolutely breathless. Let us explore the dark, twisted paths our beloved characters are walking as the landscape of Los Angeles is forever changed by desperation, deceit, and devastating tragedy. The walls of Forrester Creations have witnessed countless triumphs and tragedies, but the sheer humiliation of Ivy Forrester's recent expulsion resonated with a uniquely bitter finality. The revelation of her manipulative schemes against Electra Forrester and Will Spencer had finally caught up with her, culminating in a devastating confrontation. Ridge Forrester and Steffi Forrester Finnegan, standing as the impenetrable guardians of the family's legacy and moral code, delivered the ultimate blow. They did not just fire her. They systematically dismantled her place within the dynasty. The cold, unforgiving glares from Ridge and Steffi served as a brutal eviction notice not just from the company, but from the family itself. As Ivy was unceremoniously cast out, the heavy glass doors of the executive suite closing behind her felt like the ceiling of a tomb. The desperation that clawed at her throat was suffocating. She was losing everything: her career, her status, and her meticulously crafted identity in Los Angeles. Fleeing the towering glass and steel structure of the Forrester building, Ivy sought refuge in the only place she could control: behind the wheel of her car. Her mind was a chaotic tempest of rage, humiliation, and sheer panic. The realization that she was being exiled from the inner circle drove her to press her foot heavily onto the accelerator. She navigated the winding, treacherous roads of the Los Angeles outskirts with reckless abandon, her vision blurred by hot, stinging tears of absolute fury. The world outside her windshield became a smeared canvas of muted colors as she pushed the vehicle faster and faster, treating the desolate stretch of asphalt as an outlet for her overwhelming sense of powerlessness. She was a woman unraveling at the seams, completely consumed by the injustice of her sudden downfall, oblivious to the deadly momentum she was building with every passing second. The catastrophe materialized out of the encroaching twilight with terrifying suddenness. A vehicle appeared in her path, but Ivy's reflexes, dulled by her blinding emotional turmoil, were agonizingly slow to respond. The screeching of tires tore through the quiet evening air, a horrific prelude to the deafening symphony of twisting metal and shattering safety glass. The impact was violently absolute, a catastrophic collision that sent shockwaves through the very core of both vehicles. The world spun in a dizzying blur of deployed airbags and crushing steel before grinding to a sudden, eerie halt. For a long, breathless moment, the only sounds on the deserted road were the hiss of a ruptured radiator and the frantic, shallow breathing of a woman who had just turned her emotional wreckage into a physical nightmare. Stumbling from the mangled remains of her own car, Ivy fought through the dizzying haze of shock and minor contusions. The cool evening air bit at her skin as she staggered toward the other vehicle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The front end of the opposing car was crumpled inward, a terrifying testament to the sheer force of her reckless driving. As she peered through the spiderweb cracks of the shattered driver's side window, the breath completely evaporated from her lungs. Slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious and bleeding, was Hope Logan, the golden child of the Logan family. The woman who had always seemingly possessed the effortless grace and love that Ivy so desperately craved was now entirely at her mercy, fighting for her life in the twisted wreckage. In that breathless, horrifying moment, humanity dictated an immediate, frantic call to emergency services. A normal person would have been consumed by overwhelming guilt and terror, screaming for an ambulance to save the life they had just endangered. But as Ivy stared at Hope's vulnerable, broken form, a dark, chilling calculation began to override her initial panic. The moral compass that should have guided her actions completely shattered, replaced by the predatory instincts of a woman cornered by her own failures. She looked at Hope, and then she looked at the rapidly leaking fluids pooling beneath the engine block. Instead of a tragedy, Ivy saw a twisted, golden opportunity. She saw Liam Spencer. She saw a lifeline that could tether her to Los Angeles permanently, an unshakable anchor that not even Ridge or Steffi could sever. The sinister brilliance of her impromptu plan required immediate, grueling physical execution. Knowing that the leaking fuel would soon ignite, Ivy forced the damaged door open, the metal groaning in protest. With adrenaline masking her own aches, she grabbed the unconscious Hope and began the arduous task of dragging her away from the impending inferno. She did not do this out of the goodness of her heart. She did it to set the stage. She carefully positioned Hope a safe distance away, ensuring that her own clothes were stained with dirt and blood, deliberately smudging ash and soot across her face to complete the harrowing aesthetic. When the engine finally caught fire, sending a brilliant, terrifying plume of orange flames into the night sky, Ivy finally made the call. She ensured that when the flashing red and blue lights of the first responders arrived, they would not find a reckless driver who caused a near-fatal crash, but a battered, exhausted hero who had bravely risked her own life to pull a woman from a burning wreck. The transition from the chaotic, fiery crash site to the sterile, unforgiving environment of the hospital emergency room was a jarring shift in reality. The harsh fluorescent lights beat down on the polished linoleum floors as medical personnel swarmed around Hope's stretcher, their voices a blur of urgent medical jargon. Hope was rushed through the swinging double doors of the trauma unit, her life hanging by the most fragile of threads, suffering from severe internal injuries and a traumatic brain impact. Meanwhile, Ivy sat wrapped in a scratchy hospital blanket, playing the role of the traumatized survivor to absolute perfection. She shivered on command, staring blankly at the wall, while internally, her mind was a whirlwind of meticulous strategic planning. She was preparing for the most important performance of her life, knowing that the success of her entire future hinged on the impending arrival of Liam Spencer. When Liam finally burst through the automatic doors of the emergency room, the sheer magnitude of his terror was palpable. His usually composed demeanor was completely shattered, his eyes darting frantically around the waiting area, wide with a raw, unfiltered agony. The history between Liam and Hope was a tapestry of profound love, heartbreaking losses, and enduring connection. The mere thought of losing her in such a sudden, violent manner had stripped away all his defenses, leaving him as a raw nerve of panic and despair. He approached the reception desk, his voice cracking as he demanded information, his hands trembling with a fear so deep it seemed to radiate from his very soul. He was a man drowning in an ocean of uncertainty, desperately searching for a lifeline. This was the exact moment Ivy had been waiting for. Like a predator, sensing the profound weakness of her prey, she rose from her plastic chair and intercepted him. She called his name, her voice perfectly modulated to convey a fragile, trembling exhaustion. When Liam turned and saw her, covered in soot and dried blood, his confusion momentarily distracted him from his overwhelming panic. Ivy did not wait for him to process the situation. She immediately launched into her carefully constructed narrative. With tears welling in her eyes, tears that were genuinely fueled by the adrenaline of her deception rather than actual sorrow, she began to weave the tragic, heroic tale of the evening. She described the suddenness of the crash, conveniently omitting her own erratic driving, and painted a vivid, horrifying picture of the flames licking at the hood of Hope's car. The manipulation of Liam's grief was a masterclass in psychological exploitation. Ivy detailed the agonizing moments of pulling Hope from the wreckage, emphasizing the heat of the fire and the sheer terror of thinking she might not get her out in time. She watched closely as Liam's initial confusion morphed into a profound, overwhelming gratitude. The anger he might have felt toward the universe for this random tragedy was completely neutralized by the presence of the woman who had supposedly saved his wife from a fiery death. Ivy capitalized on his emotional vulnerability, weaving a secondary narrative of personal redemption into her tale. She looked deeply into his tear-filled eyes and whispered that the accident had fundamentally changed her. She claimed that staring death in the face, feeling the heat of the flames, had instantly burned away all her past petty grievances and manipulative desires. She offered him a fabricated epiphany, presenting herself as a woman reborn through the crucible of saving the woman he loved. Liam, entirely consumed by the trauma of the night and the terrifying uncertainty of Hope's condition, was utterly incapable of recognizing the deceit standing before him. His critical thinking was paralyzed by grief. When Ivy reached out a trembling hand to touch his arm, offering a silent, steadfast comfort, Liam completely broke down. The weight of his terror became too heavy to bear alone, and he collapsed forward, seeking solace in the arms of the very woman who had caused his nightmare. Ivy pulled him into a tight, desperate embrace, resting her chin on his shoulder. As she held the sobbing man in the quiet, echoing corridor of the hospital, a chilling sense of triumph washed over her. The toxic comfort she provided was the foundation of her new fortress. She was no longer the disgraced Forrester employee. She was the savior of the Spencer family. But Ivy's ambition did not stop at mere gratitude. The embrace, born of his profound emotional exhaustion, was merely the gateway to a much darker crossing of boundaries. As Liam slowly pulled back, his eyes searching hers for any glimmer of hope or reassurance, Ivy recognized the absolute fragility of his state. He was unmoored, desperate for connection, desperate for anything that felt like a grounding force in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. Ivy's hands lingered on his chest, her gaze softening into a look of profound, manufactured empathy. She leaned in, her movements slow and deliberate, capitalizing on his complete lack of emotional defenses. In the sterile, empty hallway, just yards away from where Hope was bleeding on a surgical table, Ivy closed the distance and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was a profound psychological violation, a moment of calculated intimacy designed to bind him to her through shared trauma and sudden, confusing guilt. For a fleeting second, Liam was too stunned, too emotionally battered to resist. The sheer shock of the contact, combined with the overwhelming gratitude he felt for her supposed heroism, created a paralyzing cognitive dissonance. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion, guilt, and lingering terror. But Ivy did not apologize. She simply looked at him with a sorrowful, understanding expression, silently communicating that she was there for him, that this shared trauma had forged an unbreakable bond between them. She had successfully planted a seed of complicated intimacy in the fertile soil of his darkest hour. The broader implications of Ivy's monstrous deception were staggering. This was not merely an act of romantic sabotage. It was a desperate, sociopathic insurance policy against her exile from Los Angeles. By positioning herself as Hope's savior and Liam's emotional confidant, she was constructing an impenetrable shield against the wrath of the Forrester family. How could Ridge and Steffi possibly maintain their banishment of a woman who had risked her own life to save Hope Logan? If they tried to cast her out now, they would look heartless and vindictive in the eyes of Liam and the rest of the community. Ivy had effectively checkmated her detractors, using the broken body of her rival as a pawn in her relentless quest for survival and dominance. The tragic irony of the situation hung heavily in the sterile hospital air. The Forrester family had just cast Ivy out for being a manipulative meddler, completely unaware that their rejection had catalyzed the birth of a truly dangerous villain. In her desperate attempt to avoid being labeled a schemer, Ivy had committed an act of manipulation so profound and grotesque that it defied comprehension. She was standing in the very epicenter of a tragedy she had entirely manufactured, receiving the tearful gratitude of the man whose life she had just shattered. It was a dizzying display of narcissistic survival, a testament to the terrifying lengths to which she would go to maintain her grip on the life she felt she deserved. Yet, beneath the surface of Ivy's triumphant calculation, a ticking time bomb was slowly counting down. The physical evidence left at the crash site, the tire marks, the point of impact, the trajectory of the vehicles, held the silent truth of her reckless driving. The police would eventually investigate, and the forensic reality of the collision might not align with the heroic narrative she had so carefully spun. More terrifying still was the prospect of Hope Logan waking up. If Hope survived the grueling surgery and the subsequent recovery, what fragments of memory might she retain from the moments just before the crash? The blinding headlights, the erratic swerve of the oncoming car, the sudden realization of impending doom. If Hope remembered any of it, Ivy's fragile house of cards would collapse in a spectacular, devastating fashion. For now, however, Ivy Forrester stood victorious in the quiet shadows of the hospital corridor. She had successfully transformed her greatest failure into her most powerful weapon. As she watched Liam pace the floor, running his hands through his hair in a state of agonizing suspense, she knew that she had fundamentally altered the trajectory of all their lives. She was no longer just a peripheral character in the grand drama of the Forrester and Logan families. She had forcibly inserted herself into the very center of their universe, binding them to her through a toxic mixture of blood, fire, and lies. The emotional wreckage she had caused would far surpass the physical wreckage left smoldering on that deserted road, cementing her legacy as a master manipulator willing to cross any conceivable line. As the long, agonizing night stretched on, the destiny of Los Angeles hung in the balance. The monitors in Hope's surgical suite beeped with a fragile, erratic rhythm, mirroring the unstable foundation of Ivy's new reality. The battle lines have been entirely redrawn, not in the boardrooms of Forrester Creations, but in the sterile, unforgiving arena of a hospital emergency ward. The consequences of this night would echo through the generations, a dark testament to the destructive power of desperation and the terrifying capability of a woman who refuses to be forgotten. We will continue to monitor this explosive storyline, bringing you every shocking revelation as the truth fights to claw its way out of the darkness. Stay tuned.